thank you for everyone that's joined us today to talk about the fertility challenges your employees might be going through and how to best support them. And I'm really, really pleased that I've got with me, and I should have said, I suppose, my name is Eileen and I'm the Executive Director at Fertifa. But I'm really pleased, and I was already excited to go straight to Suzanne because she's the star of the webinar today. But we've got Suzanne Johnston with us from Stevenson Harwood. So thank you so much. Do you mind introducing yourself quickly for us, Suzanne?
Hi, yep, sure. Hi, I'm Suzanne, and I'm a lawyer at Stevenson Harwood in their Singapore office, and I have my own fertility journey that was lived out in Asia. Eileen, did you want me to talk about that now or at a later point?
If you don't mind, since we've had that poll and we've seen, about 40% of people who are with us today have had their own challenge or their own journey, I think if you don't mind sharing your personal journey with us, that'll help certainly give them the context as to why you have maybe some of the perspectives that you have.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm very open about my journey. And I hate the phrase journey, but for want of a better word, I'll use it. My journey began back in, and I'm sorry, I've got very poor internet connection, so I'm apologizing. But my journey began back in January 2015, and I found out that I was pregnant naturally, and that was a huge shock because I was diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome. Not that anybody ever really explained what that meant. But I was just basically told that could mean conceiving would be more difficult. And then at 6 weeks, I went for a scan. I had a heartbeat, and the doctor said, it'll be plain sailing from here on in. And then very sadly lost that baby at 7 weeks, and had to have a D&C, which is the operation you have to remove the fetus if you have a miscarriage, which is traumatic as and of itself. And at the time, I was an associate at a different international law firm, and I hadn't told my bosses what was going on. And I was just in absolute pieces, complete shock, and ended up having to take annual leave basically to deal with it all. And I remember taking 2 weeks, which actually wasn't enough probably for my mental state. And then following that, we decided that we really wanted to try in earnest for a baby. And so we went to see different doctors in Singapore. One fertility doctor told me at my second appointment, not everyone is meant to get pregnant. Oh, can you hear me now? Eileen, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Suzanne.
Not everyone is meant to get pregnant. Maybe you should just give up. And we face like a lot of kind of defeatist attitudes from doctors. And needless to say, after that happened, we changed doctors pretty quickly. Eventually, we found a doctor that we liked, and I was given some medication to help me ovulate, and we fell pregnant again. And then that was my daughter, who was born in 2016. And she arrived at 36 weeks by emergency C-section, all very traumatic, but we got there. And I felt after that journey, gosh, that was really hard. But little did I know that actually that was just the beginning of the fertility struggles I was going to have. So they really began properly. Although I would say that any of this, all of it is important and relevant. But for me, I felt like the hardest part of my journey came when I was trying for my second child. And in that case, we ended up doing numerous IUIs. That one resulted in a pregnancy, and I remember that very well. I was walking to work and I got a call from the clinic and they said, "You're pregnant." I was so happy. They said, "Come in for a repeat blood test." So I went in, and then at that they repeated the blood test, and I skipped into the office. I was so happy. And then around 2 p.m. that day, I got a WhatsApp from a doctor's clinic, and it said HCG falling, which is the hormone related to pregnancy. Stop all medications. this will be a miscarriage. And you can imagine like getting that in a WhatsApp was pretty galling. And then I had to go into a presentation at a big private bank 20 minutes later. And it was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done. I couldn't formulate my thoughts. And I didn't cover myself in glory. And I actually did a lot of damage to my own mental health, I think, going into that that presentation in that state. And that was a turning point for me. So that was when I decided to tell my employers what was going on. And because I just knew that I couldn't put myself in that position again. And then after that failure with IUI, we moved on to IVF. And we did numerous transfers. We did an egg retrieval in Singapore, then numerous transfers, and long story short, all of them resulted in miscarriage. And by the end of 2018, I was just in complete pieces. I'd had my 5th miscarriage at 7 weeks, another D&C followed, and I was at a complete loss as to what to do. And my doctor said, "We think you've got poor egg quality, so you'll have to do testing on the embryos, but surprise, surprise, you're not allowed to do that in Singapore, so you have to go and do it all again in Malaysia." And that was really, really tough. But I did. I started it all again in Malaysia in January 2019, and did another egg retrieval. And at this point, in terms of just relating it back to my career, I had decided that I could not continue being in a client-facing role. And so I'd applied for a role in-house at a private bank as their in-house legal counsel. And I'd been offered that role. And actually it was a 5-day week role, and I felt very proud of myself because I managed to negotiate it down to 4 days a week for less pay and more stress, probably in the long run. But I'd accepted that role, and so I was due to move there in the February 2019, and I did that. And then off the back of that, I did another embryo transfer in March 2019 in Malaysia, and didn't get any pregnancy at all. And this was with one of the tested embryos. And I think at that point, I just felt completely and utterly like more broken than I even thought I felt even then I felt before. I just didn't know what else to do. I felt I'd tried everything. I'd even changed my job that was meant to be less stressful. And also because I'd started a new job, I was starting again from scratch in terms of getting to know my employer. So I hadn't told them what I was going through either. And I do remember like there were just moments over the next 6 months sort of sat at my desk with tears in my eyes, or, crying actually, because somebody had texted me to say they were pregnant, or I'd get back from a doctor's appointment and it'd be more bad news. And it was really, really challenging. And again, I did end up speaking to my employer and telling them, look, I am going through this because I just felt I just couldn't continue to work and not be open about the situation. And again, I describe it as being lucky because my boss was very understanding, and he's an older male Singaporean man, so it was quite a difficult conversation to have, but he was very understanding, and he said to me, family is the most important thing. And the reason why I sort of say I was lucky is because I was at his whim, right? There was no policy in place, so I didn't know how he was going to react. I think at the point I told him I was still on my probationary period, so it could, in theory, he could have just found a reason to get rid of me. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a really strong advocate now for having fertility policies in place so that people know where they stand. Anyway, long story short, after a hiatus of about 6 months, changing doctors, doing all manner of things like acupuncture, moxibustion, naturopath. I mean, I threw the kitchen sink at it. I did another embryo transfer in September 2019, and I got pregnant with my son. And that was it was wonderful, but at the same time, given my experience with loss, I fully expected to lose the baby. I was put on bed rest for the whole pregnancy because I had bleeding and I was seen as a very high risk pregnancy. So I had to work remotely, and that was before COVID, just, before COVID kind of seeped into it, but it started before COVID. So people weren't really working remotely then. But I like to say lucky, because my boss was very understanding and allowed me to do so at a time when it wasn't really the done thing. And then very fortunately, our son was born. Again, he was born early at 36 weeks in May 2020. And I bring that up as well, because I think that's another thing that's not that well known about infertility, and that's that people who have infertility can have more challenging pregnancies, and also basically a more birth. A lot of people end up having to have C-sections, and that can be traumatic as and of itself. When my daughter arrived at 36 weeks, the first time, with my first baby, it was such a shock because my waters broke in the middle of the night, and it's not what I expected to happen. I think with my son, I was a bit more prepared because it had already happened once. But it was very traumatic, especially with my daughter. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think that's something that people perhaps don't appreciate. So that's a bit of background to my journey.
I really appreciate that. And now you were kind to ask whether or not I thought it was a good time for you to go through that and share that experience. I should have gone first because I feel bad. I can't follow that up. But in the context of our conversation, I also went through 3 rounds of IVF in 2017 myself here in London. So we can compare and contrast some of the access points that you made. I didn't have live birth, but I can offer, if we end up coming on this later, I think if I had been successful with my own fresh eggs, as they described them, I would have set a world record. So I probably shouldn't have started any one of them, or let alone 3 at the time. But I really appreciate you sharing your journey and everything that you went through. Certainly so many ups and downs. And it's really helpful that you've also intertwined how that impacted, obviously, your career, your job, when and how you chose to communicate, for example, with your manager and the like. And I'm kind of bringing it all together because I should have also mentioned in the introduction, while we're here to talk about fertility challenges that employees will go through and how to support them, part of the reason we're doing that today and in this week is because it is actually Baby Loss Awareness Week. It's also Mental Health Awareness Week, even outside of fertility experiences, if we don't want to say journeys. So everything that you've described is so relevant, and really appreciate that, because obviously deeply personal, and it must not be pleasant to have to relive it or to recount it like you've just done for us, but really helpful, because I think from even your journey, your experience, we can pull out some of the things that we discussed before the webinar about what we might want to float and see if other people who are participating today will want to chime in on or contribute. And so maybe with that, we start with the very first fertility challenge that we had spoken about before, which is access to treatment. And that's not just access. You're in Singapore, I'm in the UK, whether there's, an NHS type public healthcare system or not, whether there might be cultural or regulatory challenges to getting certain types of testing or treatment, whether one can afford it, and whether or not, companies want to support that financial burden, and other things that will sort of impact the actual treatment itself. And so I don't know if there's anything that you maybe wanted to start with when you think about, when you were first at work, before you even had any idea of what you might be getting yourself into. And like you said, it was initially a surprise pregnancy and then a decision then to try, how you went about determining what you had access to, how that might have played on your mind, how that might have impacted you at work while you were trying to get things done for your job, whether or not the financial burden came up for you or not. Oh, and again, maybe if you want to touch back on to any ramifications of the regulatory or cultural and social, issues that you had with respect to accessing, and then maybe I'll come back on the UK sort of experience I had.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't have an NHS in Singapore, so that if you're going to go into this here, you're going to have to. Employer didn't cover anything. They covered maternity benefits, and that, to be honest, that was fairly narrow anyway, and not very much money comparatively to what you end up spending here. And that, I suppose that's another point to make. It's like when you finally get pregnant by IVF, and if it's a high risk pregnancy, you're at the doctor's nearly every week. So we ended up spending a fortune on those appointments as well as the actual IVF, because the amount I got from my employer was so small, particularly with my second when I was at bank. That there, I think it was $3,000, which really doesn't cover anything. There are, if you're a Singaporean, there are some government subsidies for IVF, but they don't apply to foreigners and they don't cover the whole cost of the treatment. In terms of like the culture here, culturally, you have to be married to do any form of fertility treatment. So actually, when we got pregnant by accident, we weren't married. And then when we found that we needed to do fertility treatment, we had to get married in order to do so. So yeah, we kind of had a bit of a shotgun wedding to get pregnant, which is quite funny. The other thing to say is that, you know, for that reason, it's very challenging for same-sex people to enter into any kind of fertility treatment in Singapore. And you can't do donor eggs here, you can't do surrogacy here. So when I was about to do my 5th embryo transfer that ended up being my son, I'd said to my husband, this is the last one I'm ever going to do because I'm completely broken. And I said, we'll have to do surrogacy next. We had embryos. So I said, that's what we're going to do because I can't do this again. And we were having to look to the US basically because it's just not possible in Singapore. So I think, and the reason why I wanted to kind of bring up these differences is as well, just tying it back to fertility policies that employers might put in place. It can be quite challenging because different jurisdictions, particularly for a global company like mine, where we have, you know, the UK, Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, different jurisdictions have very different approaches to fertility and to people having babies, essentially. And so it can be quite challenging to craft a policy that kind of seems fair across all the different jurisdictions. And equally, you've got to question whether maybe you have to give bigger amounts of time off for employees who are somewhere like Singapore who want to do surrogacy because they're not able to do it in country. So I wanted to kind of bring that up because I think that's something that, again, unless you've been through this and you've had you know, this cross-jurisdictional experience as well, you might not necessarily appreciate that.
Yeah, no, thank you for flagging that. And your point about just using that as one reason for putting a policy in place, I think we'll come back and talk about in general the value of putting policies in place. But, you know, it's a great point, which is, you know, organizations, especially post-COVID, now have more and more employees that are working from different locations. And so to make sure that, you know, a benefit or coverage is available and accessible, which is this particular topic, to everybody, no matter where they're based, is really important. And so to clarify and communicate what that means and how that looks like, again, based on local issues, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just picking up on the other part of your question, which was about the financial impact of infertility. For me, the financial impact was enormous. You know, there were a number of times where I wanted to quit my job because I felt so overwhelmed and I couldn't because I need to keep working to pay for the treatment. And with hindsight, I'm glad I did keep working because I think I would have gone insane had I not kept working. And I'm lucky that I was able to do that. And I think also the point I wanted to make here is just that the cost is not just the IVF itself. As I say, if you're fortunate enough to get pregnant, it's the treatment there, but it's also, you know, things like seeing a naturopath, seeing an acupuncturist, seeing a counselor. I mean, I had to see a counselor every week, and honestly speaking, I wouldn't have got through the journey without that person supporting me and talking me off a ledge, you know, pretty much on a weekly basis. And I think there are other hidden costs. So, for example, you know, taking a step back in your career. So when I went in-house, as I said, I I negotiated for a lower salary so that I could work fewer days a week. My husband, he's 2 years younger than me. When we met, I out earned him, and over those years of infertility where my focus really wasn't on work and it was growing my family, he exponentially out earned me and continues to do so. And it was only really when I came out of the fertility experience and had my son that I felt I could focus on my career again. And that's when I took up the partnership with Stevenson Harwood. So I think that's another cost of infertility, and I think it's one that in the main affects women. I know a lot of these issues affect men as well, but generally it's the women who's sort of take a step back to kind of do, because in a lot of cases the treatments are focused on the woman. So my husband did have some fertility issues as well, like poor morphology in his sperm, but the treatment for that is popping a few pills and eating more healthily. It's not having to inject yourself every day. And so, just by virtue of what you're both doing to get that baby, it often falls more on the woman in terms of the career breaks. And that's something that I'm quite passionate about and cognizant about, because I think it's something people don't talk about enough.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I would love to have another webinar conversation with you about sort of gender disparity and other things that come out as a result of reproductive health and how that impacts people at work. But we don't have time for that today because it would be such an expensive conversation. And I also think, though, it's worth flagging. And, it sounds like your husband, in terms of what they suggested he do, was not super intrusive or particularly debilitating. But we also do know that in some cases for men, it could be a little bit more taxing. And certainly if there's a same-sex male couple, not in Singapore, but, who's going to undergo surrogacy, for example, there might be a lot of testing they would do before they would determine who was potentially going to be the semen donor, for example, and the like. So I think one of the things that, we really want to stress, and part of the reason we're holding this conversation this week is because a lot of the challenges that we would have experienced but know of, and from others we've tried to support in the workplace, can be things that wouldn't be obvious. We talk about being hidden, and you've already mentioned so many things that I think are so valuable. I've been taking notes about, and somebody has kindly mentioned in the chat that they hadn't thought about the correlation, for example, between fertility challenges and then subsequently maybe more difficult or higher risk pregnancy. And there's just so much to it that, as you say, rightly so, fertility journey makes it sound like, we're going off on holiday, versus an experience that's really going to have its ups and downs. And I think the feeling is that even us, given our personal experiences, don't know what people might be going through. And you've already stressed, therefore, that's why it's so important. So coming back then to access, even if we weren't talking about, say, the UK or Singapore specifically, I think maybe something that's maybe broadly applicable to others in the UK and across Europe is that a lot of, companies, before they start thinking about really what can be involved in a fertility challenge, they might make the presumption that the public healthcare system will look after people or can help take care of it. And it's just something I wanted to flag, where certainly here in the UK, and I do think across Europe as well, we're seeing, unfortunately, less and less access, really, or it's more and more restricted. And it's understandable, right, because of funding burdens and budgets with respect to our healthcare system. But we clearly have a bit of a lottery here with respect to where somebody lives in the UK. It's particularly difficult for people who are LGBT or identify as that way and might be in a same-sex relationship. There's going to be restrictions on BMI, body mass index, perhaps, unintentionally so, restrictions on whether or not people have had children from a previous relationship or anything like that. And so you're seeing all sorts of challenges. And then even if one does qualify, at least here in the UK, there's very, very long wait lists. And, you're seeing that some people are concerned that even if they do fall within the grounds of being qualified or eligible now, by the time they would come up for treatment, they may be then outside of the age, acceptable sort of age band to get that treatment. So access really is much more difficult than I think, again, for somebody who hasn't gone through it or hasn't known somebody who's going through it, or for somebody who might be thinking about a policy, might like to presume. And I think we would all hope that there was greater access to public healthcare systems, since we do have those systems available to us. But the reality of it is that it's less and less accessible. And so again, then going down the path of what else is available, if one has to go to a private clinic, it is the case, like you said, where financial, the financial questions, considerations alone, merit a lot of thought and can bring on a lot of anxiety. And hope you don't mind my saying, because I would say the same. I think we're both fortunate. We're in, relatively high paying sectors, historically higher paying sectors compared to, say, a retail sector, hospitality sector, healthcare, and elsewhere. And for us to have, had to really take stock, you felt pressure, you couldn't stop working, you needed to pay for your treatment. Sounds like your employer at some point was even contributing 3,000 Singapore dollars, which, I think anything goes, it helps, but you knew it wasn't going to cover the full treatment cycle. Yeah, it's a lot for people to consider, right? And, again, I think within a policy, certainly what we say at Fertifa to our prospective clients or the workplaces we work with, it's still worth having the well-being support and the navigational advice, and certainly a policy in place, even if the balance sheet doesn't allow for, helping with the financial burden, because the emotional burden, the well-being burden is already so great. But then even if there is that 3,000 Singapore dollars, 250, pounds, 1,000 pounds, the sort of the acknowledgements, therefore, and the gesture, knowing to recognize that the financial hardship is meaningful, I think also goes a long way. But even if that can't be, taken care of or accounted for, it's not a reason not to put in place a policy and not to put in place maybe other benefits that can support the emotional well-being or the navigational advice that people seek.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that I wanted to get out. But you're absolutely right about the hidden costs as well. I think everyone would probably know the headline cost of IVF or egg freezing, but there is so much more, based on personal circumstances, that people might have to think about what needs to be paid for.
And I did, when I was thinking about this, just picking up on what you were saying about, I was fortunate because we could actually afford to pay for it, and we had that luxury. And I do very much see that as a luxury. And I felt there were moments where I just was like, I am so grateful that I have this job and I can pay for this treatment, because this is the most important thing in my life. Some people use their money, they're able to buy an amazing house. And for me, I was like, this is what I would rather buy, this treatment. But I did want to make the point as well, and I think it's something that often gets forgotten, because everybody likes to see a happy ending. Everybody likes to see, IVF, results in a baby. And when I was going through it, so many people were like, oh, my best friend's cousin did IVF and then she got twins, and, and she did it first time. And you hear about all these cases, which, by the way, I mean, for me was complete and utter nonsense, because it took me 5 attempts. And I know many people who it's taken many more than that. But the point I wanted to make is that, at the end of it, you don't always end up with a baby, and then you can end up childless, not by choice, is the terminology that's used. And I think that those they get left out of the narrative when it comes to talking about fertility and reproductive health. And what happens to those people that you have working for you who don't end up with a baby at the end of this? What support systems can you put in place to help them? For me, I can look back and I can go, well, I spent all that money, but it was worth it because I've got my precious little boy. It must be incredibly difficult to go through all of that and spend all of that money and put all of that effort in and put your body through all of that and not end up with that. And that, I actually find that just absolutely heartbreaking, because that was always my biggest fear when I was going through all of this, that I wouldn't get a baby at the end of it. And so, yeah, I did just want to just want to mention that, because I think it's really important to bring that into the discussion.
No, you're absolutely right. And actually, that's a perfect segue, I think, to the second challenge we were going to talk about, which is that infertility and fertility challenges just impact so many people and in so many different ways. And so, as you say, we talk about it, and most of the time it's a foregone conclusion that we're talking about the experience until the pregnancy, but there's just as many, if not more, that don't result in a pregnancy or a live birth. And so I mentioned I went through 3 rounds and I didn't get successfully pregnant. And so even now, sometimes I think about, should I have done something different? Should we have not taken that weekend trip? Or should I have not done that kind of, that sort of volunteering, or that kind of, did I run up the stairs? You just start to question and second guess everything that you did. Should I have tried a different clinic that time, whatever it might be. And so, yeah, it can linger and it can kind of stay with you for quite some time, right? And the whole point about how these challenges can affect so many people is that it's also about the partner, if one has a partner that they're going through this with. And so, it's oftentimes really difficult if it is the case, like for instance, you described with you and your husband, where a lot of the burden, the physical toll was on you, and it does sound like he did have to take some medication, for example. But we know from other experiences, it's very difficult to watch someone you love go through something that's, meant to be for your collective benefit. And there's not much you can do, and you just kind of see them go through it. And so, it's just as important for us to recognize when we talk about this and the type of support in the workplace, we might be looking and needing to support a colleague who isn't the one who can take the injections, but they've got to watch and they've got to be strong or be brave for their partner or their other half, and maybe what support they'll need or they'll want as well. And so we're talking about those that go through the treatment, before the treatment, after the treatment, depending on what happens. And you just slowly, you end up with, we saw in our poll, 40% of those on the webinar today have gone through a challenge. But again, if we think about the hidden and the sort of even second level indirect kind of, impacts, I suspect, we're certainly over 3/4, maybe 80% of people that are affected one way or another.
100%. And, and also, especially for same-sex couples where they're doing surrogacy, that I have a few friends who've done that journey, and it's incredibly difficult. And I think it's hard because, outwardly they're not pregnant, so they don't get like the same kind of, reaction as a pregnant woman would get. And that of itself creates lots of different thoughts and feelings. And like a friend of mine went for a scan with his partner and their surrogate, and the doctor sort of said, looked at him and the surrogate and sort of said, assumed that it was their baby, like as in they were doing it together, not him and his husband. And I think all of that is it's something really interesting to unpack. I mean, I obviously can't speak from my own experiences, so when I'm talking a lot about it from my experience, from the female experience, but I am very aware that the spectrum is huge as to what different people experience, and I don't mean to undermine male infertility issues, because I do know that can be, I've got another friend whose husband, he basically, it was basically his reason, it was because of him that they struggled to conceive, and I think it was very difficult for them because he just had no support network at all. He didn't feel that he could talk to his friends about it, because it's kind of like this macho thing as well, that you can't really, tell the lads that, that you're kind of, going through this. And I think that's a whole other side of it, that I'm not, plugged into. But I do think, again, it all comes back to, like we've been saying, what can employers do to support? And I think the main thing that they can do is to really keep an open mind about this and do their research and appreciate, like you've said, that it affects people in many different ways. And it can be, it could be the least likely person in your office that it's affecting, and they're not telling anybody. And that might be why their work isn't as good that week, or they're, taking more leave than they used to. So, and that's why I think it's really important to have policies in place so those people feel that they can say something to a designated person within the business. and they can at least have that support at work.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And I appreciate how you've just framed all that, because that's invited, one of the participants to say, that as a male, who's gone through a fertility experience, he's had a specific experience, and he's noted and remembers how most of the treatment is definitely female focused, and what more, could he have done, or sort of what he felt like when he was going through it. He happens to mention that he was in the armed forces when he did. So thank you for sharing that. And, if there's more that, he would like to offer that you'd want us to say out to the rest of the webinar and the attendees, really happy to do that. But it sounds like he's basically, telling you preach to Suzanne. So thank you so much. And I think you hit the nail on the head with respect to organizations and leaders. You said, the first thing is they just really need to be aware. I think in addition to that, we want them to really pay attention and prioritize how these topics are so important for employee productivity and well-being. And then secondly, because as we've all established, and then this gentleman also chimed in as well, because we may not know who's going through these things, to really normalize talking about these topics in a way so that individuals will recognize the workplace is there to support. And I think otherwise, if we don't do that, we just have more and more people that we can't count and we don't know, who are just suffering on their own or in silence, and they're struggling through it. And so, as you say, we want them to really make this priority, recognize that this is such an important topic that impacts so many people, even those that we wouldn't see or otherwise think of as obvious or natural. Normalize it so it's a safe space. And then, like you say, make sure there's policies in place that really clarify for people how they can approach it, or how it can be approached, and how they're going to be supported. So thank you for all that. I think then we should move on to the third challenge that we had spoken about before jumping on the webinar, which is really the overall impact. And so we talked initially about access to financial burden and such, but then the impact about this, and in terms of how it's really affecting people at work, you've already again shared from your personal experience how you felt like you couldn't be client facing after a time, affected how you wanted to deal with, or how you could speak with your manager, but also how lucky you were that you were at your manager's kind of mercy in terms of how they might decide you should be treated or supported. And we've got statistics, for example, from Fertility Network UK, which says that 90% of people who go through fertility treatment do experience depression. And you mentioned that you went to weekly counseling. And so, and 3/4 of those people indicated lack of a supportive workplace. Now, again, in the poll, we saw how many people said that their organization had policies or didn't. We are using as maybe a very crude proxy that having a policy means there's some level of support, but maybe that's actually a luxury as well. And so I don't know if you wanted to talk about how then, when you went through it, you didn't have sort of official or formal workplace support, but you had your manager who was supportive. Any idea of what you would have done if that manager wouldn't have been as approachable? It sounded like you put that off anyway, or what would you have considered changing jobs again? What would have been your sort of next go-to?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did get lucky when I changed jobs, that I had such a lovely man as my manager, and to this day I can honestly say he's one of the nicest people I've ever met. So, I mean, I was very, very lucky. And, had I not had that, I think it would have actually had a really very bad impact on the rest of the, experience. I think in a way, having him be so supportive and kind of validating me and what I was going through, saying, well, I understand family is the most important thing, you've got to do what you've got to do. Helped me feel like I wasn't being annoying. I don't know how better to explain that, but I kind of feel like I felt, as a woman, well, me personally anyway, in my profession, it's kind of like, oh, you feel like you're annoying if you get pregnant, and then you have to have time off for maternity leave, and then to add into that you're even more annoying because you're actually actively trying to get pregnant, and that's going to mean that you're going to need time off and you're going to need support. It just feels like a double whammy. And it, and so if you don't have somebody that validates that for you and says, it's okay, I understand, you've got to do what you've got to do, I think that can be really, really damaging. And on the mental health side of things, I did just want to talk a little bit about that just quickly, because I think it's really, really important. And I think a lot of people, particularly in law, I go back to law because that's what I know. There's been a lot of stigma around mental health issues for lawyers. And there's almost this perception that if you have mental health challenges, you're not as good a lawyer because you can't cope, or you're not a safe pair of hands. And I just think that's utter nonsense, and that kind of rhetoric needs to stop. And that's why, for me, I am very open that basically my fertility struggles had a huge impact on my mental health. Definitely led to me having some form of PTSD. And we were saying the other day, Eileen, that even now I am triggered by certain things. I can be triggered by a pregnancy announcement, or somebody sort of saying, oh God, oh God, I can't believe I'm pregnant, how annoying. That kind of comment upsets me. It shouldn't do, but it does. And the other thing, the bigger thing as well, is the way I parent my own children. It definitely means that I get a lot more anxious about their health. So if one of them has a fever or something, I really find that hard. To the point where I really don't want to be at work. I don't want to be in that client meeting. I want to be at home with my kids, because I'm terrified of losing them. And I think every parent probably is, but I just feel like, I know comparatively to some of my friends, that I probably go a bit too overboard about this stuff, because I've just because it was just so hard to get there and to have them, that even now I've got them, I'm always scared they're going to be taken away from me. And so I think it's important to recognize that just because somebody comes out of this whole experience with children does not mean that they are fully healed. And frankly, I probably won't ever be fully healed. I mean, this week is Baby Loss Awareness Week, and it's a week that I really struggle with. I hate this week because it's when I really start thinking about all of the babies that I lost, and I actually find it a really challenging week to get through. And so I think, I just wanted to mention that I think the mental health side of this has been wildly underestimated for far too long. And we really need to spend more time focusing on it.
No, I mean, I'm glad you highlighted. And again, thank you for being so open and honest with your personal experience. And then, of course, joining us for this week, because I had mentioned at the top of the hour why we chose this week. But, we know that it really was extra effort for you. So we appreciate that and really value that. And I think, as you say, on the mental health side of things, no surprise, we had talked about one of the conclusions, hopefully, that others would come along with us during this conversation, is that a way organizations can support their employees with fertility challenges is to offer access to counseling, and to make sure that, we always, or we don't always, but you can often think about the actual clinical treatment of the IVF, the medication, the injections, and just to make sure that people's mental well-being is also looked after. And that it's also not just, for the month of your cycle, and then after that, it's as you say, it lingers. Even if it results in a pregnancy, it lingers because then there's anxiety about that high risk pregnancy. If it doesn't result in a pregnancy, clearly there's then that, what I mentioned, the second guessing and the doubts and the whether or not I want to do it again. And somebody else has very kindly noted in the chat that they suffered PTSD as well from their pregnancy losses. And actually, you mentioned what triggers you for this particular week. This person says they get triggered, unfortunately, almost every month after they come off the period, because they've realized that they haven't gotten pregnant. And, we see that, again, another stat, and this one is from Tommy's, which is a charity that you'll know in the UK for pregnancy loss. More than 1 in 4 women, actually, it's almost 30%, meet the official sort of clinical criteria for PTSD after pregnancy loss. And a lot of that will be the consequence of fertility treatment, right? So, I think access to counseling alongside sort of offering time off. And you mentioned you don't even think you had enough time off, and you did, in terms of supporting people to give them the headspace to deal with what they're going through. We've already touched on how important it is to make sure leadership is really attuned to these things. So educating managers, team leads, And I think, you know, we're going to say it again, but we said it before, implementing the policy, which really helps as sort of the guardrails, right? To make sure that you know what to cover, we know what to discuss, we know what's been addressed, what hasn't been. You can sort of apply it to all employees, different locations and the like. And I guess the only other thing, which from a practical point of view, and I want to be careful it's not a sort of an advert, but, you know, working with a benefits provider, and we had the poll at the beginning about how many people and their companies did and yet did not yet still, whether it's for TIFA or one of our, you know, peer, you know, companies that are in the sector, which we're flattered to be able to work alongside and sometimes even complement and work hand in hand in partnership with some workplaces. You know, there are so many of us out there now that weren't maybe when you started your journey, certainly when I did mine. That's really, you know, so obvious in terms of being able to be specialized, knowing about everything that might be involved in a challenge, who it might impact, how to have those conversations, what then could feed into the policy as we've just described, how to help benchmark with the extent of paid leave, maybe financial contributions, even counseling, for example, and education. So I think that's, you know, the one point that we sort of wanted to emphasize. Don't know if there's anything else you'd cover other than those 4 points that I made about what we'd like workplaces to do.
I think there's practical things that you can do as a workplace as well. So one of the things that I found used to really depress me, was like the icing on the cake, I suppose, would be when I had to do injections at the office and I had to hide them in a lunchbox in the fridge, because at this point I hadn't told anybody what was going on. And then frankly, actually, would I really want a load of needles sat there in front of everyone in the office? Probably not. And then I would have to go and inject myself in the toilets. And that's such a low point for me. And it had a small room, didn't even need to be very big, with a small fridge. That would have made me feel much more accepted, more normalized. So I think there are things like that that can be done that are, you know, it's all well and good having the policies, but I think you just touched on it, Eileen. You've got to, you can't just have a policy there and forget about it and it sit dusty on the shelf. You've got to actually educate your employees about it. You've got to breathe life into it by implementing the support around it. And I've just seen somebody's comment, yeah, it really isn't easy. I've also injected myself in an aeroplane. That really wasn't fun either. And in a car park. Yeah, and it just adds to the whole misery of the whole thing. It's already hard enough what you're going through. And I think the other practical side of it is the appointments, because they're so sporadic and you don't necessarily know when they're going to be. Because so your doctor might say, actually, you know, you need to come back for an extra scan tomorrow, because in my case, I had a really thin uterine lining and they were always monitoring it. And they were like, oh, it's not what we expected to see today. And then you'd come away feeling crestfallen and, oh God, the whole cycle's going to be cancelled. And they say, well, come back in tomorrow, take another 10 tablets tonight. We'll see what's happened, you know. And so it would be very last minute, the appointment. And then that's part of the reason why I left a client facing role, because I didn't feel I could say to clients, oh, I have to cancel the meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. or whenever it is, because I have to go to the doctors to get another injection or another scan. And so I think, you know, it's very important for employers to be cognizant of that and to, you know, recognize that when somebody is going through a cycle, they will have to drop things and go to appointments at the drop of a hat, and that's the way it is. And you're spending all this money on something, it's not like you're going to miss the appointment, because then your whole cycle can get cancelled. So that's something that I really wish people had understood. And even when I got pregnant as well, you know, there would be times I would wake up and I had bleeding, and I'd, you know, and for me, I think I mentioned this to you, Eileen, I had what they call scanxiety, I discovered. And that is basically, you need the reassurance of a scan. So you go for a lot of scans, and then, you know, as soon as the scan's over, you're like, oh my God, I've lost my baby again. And it's this constant reassurance. You go in, you see the baby, you're fine. 5 minutes later, you come out, you worry again. Saying I had loo fear as well, which is another thing that I only knew there was a term for relatively recently. And that's sort of when I would go to the toilet at work, I'd be desperately scared that there was going to be bleeding and that I'd lost my baby. And so I think, you know, employers need to cut people going through this some slack, and they need to recognize that they are not going to be on their full game, and that they need time to be able to go to the doctors, and that they're dealing with a lot emotionally and physically.
I think that's such a great recap, which is that we need people to recognize, as much as we could have this webinar be 3 hours long. And by the way, I think I'm going to try and wrap it up now, even though we've got questions in the chat, because I usually like to give people a few minutes before their next call is scheduled during the working day. But as much as we've talked about so many different experiences, yours, mine, you talked about some of your other colleagues and friends, and I really appreciate those as well. And people have offered in the chat their own as well. To sort of recap some of the points we covered earlier, this affects so many people. Fertility challenges affect so many people directly as well as indirectly, sort of almost second order, that we wouldn't know. It's not always visible. And it's really important, therefore, for organizations and leaders to be aware of this, to prioritize it, to normalize the conversation about it and make it a safe place, to put in place policies, to make sure that mental health, mental well-being is covered, and to make sure that they're thinking about the practical considerations, which frankly, like the idea you gave about where to inject and things like that, are only possible by talking to colleagues, right? By talking to employees and the like. So really appreciate you highlighting all of those points. And I think I really do not want to go straight up to the hour. The only other thing I want to mention is, it's not a poll, but we are running another survey with Fertility Network UK. So given all of the great comments, the great questions that we've had, if people can fill in that type form, we would appreciate it, because it'll help inform what we're going to try and perpetuate and advocate for more through press, through media mentions and things like that, and try and help shape the conversation. So please chip in there. I do know that there are other questions teed up. I am sorry we're not getting to all of them. Tried to incorporate as many as we could as we went along. We will answer in the chat so that you'll be able to see those if you stay on. But even after we end the webinar, if you do want to ask us more questions, please feel free to just get in touch by email at enquiries, enquiries @fertifa.com. Obviously, stay tuned to us on LinkedIn if you want to join another conversation. But before and I appreciate all the emoji reacts and the things, and before we lose Suzanne again, maybe on internet, do want to make sure I really give you a great shout out. Thank you so much for joining today. Thank you so much for joining, particularly on a difficult week for you. Thank you for being so honest and open and sharing all of your sort of experiences, as well as everything that you've heard. Can't thank you enough, and especially with the time zone where you are in Singapore, so giving us your time in the evening. I really appreciate that. So thank you so much, Suzanne, and thanks so much to all of you for tuning in and joining us for the conversation too. I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and I hope you have a good evening, Suzanne.
Thank you. And thank you, everything. Really great. Thank you.
No, thank you. Bye.